this year, 2022, I turned 75.
Good grief. You're not old enough to be 75, David.
Absolutely. I still have a 15-year-old, but never mind. It's a great time to reflect on many things. I've been really lucky to have had this amazing learning journey, and I've got a long way to go still. At least that's what everybody, including Bob Garvey, who's with me now, keeps telling me. Along the way, I've encountered all sorts of other pioneers, thinkers and influencers within the fields of coaching, mentoring, and leadership. And all three of those areas are about having great conversations that stimulate creative thinking through the bringing together of ideas. So that's why we've created this series. It's a fitting time to have conversations with colleagues who've also been in the field for a long time. So my guest today is Bob Garvey, who I first met through our mutual friend, David Megginson, the late David Megginson, with whom we co-authored quite a few books as well. Our mutual interest at the beginning was mentoring, and over years that's blossomed into coaching too. So welcome, Bob. Thank you for joining me. And my first question to you is, what brought you into mentoring, Bob?
Oh, well, it wasn't necessarily straightforward. And well, the first thing was, in my teenage years, I had a girlfriend who was very into literature, and she introduced me to the word mentoring. And I can remember being, 17 or 18, saying, what on earth's that? And having discussions about it quite a lot. And then it kind of went off the horizon and didn't really think about it too much. But I then became a teacher, and I went on a course. I was a primary school teacher, and I went on a course which was about employing science as a vehicle for helping children to learn and reason. And the whole program was based around questions. So, a kid would, as kids did in primary schools, they'd bring in a stick, and they'd say, what is it? And, the standard teacher would say, well, put it on the nature table, dear, and we'll look at it. But I used to say, oh, where did you find that? What was around it? What were some of the other things doing? Let's have a look at this twig. What shape can you see here? And how are the buds arranged? And what do they look like? And so a whole sense of inquiry. And I realized later that was how I understood mentoring. But the real impact was, I was working in management development as a management development consultant for a consultancy company who I worked for years, and a client said to me, could I do a workshop on mentoring? And I went, yeah, of course. Rushed off and tried to find something written about it, and of course I didn't find very much, except a book called Everyone Needs a Mentor, which I read. And I thought, right, I can create a program around this, and so I did. And eventually, I got so interested in the idea of mentoring. The course went down really well with people, by the way. They really liked it. And I got very interested in it and decided I needed to look into it. And so I did a PhD on mentoring, and it was called Mentoring in the Marketplace, Studies of Learning at Work. And that was a long time ago now. But yeah, so that's how I started. And I never have lost interest in the whole idea.
Yeah, well, we've certainly collaborated on a lot of projects over the years, haven't we?
Indeed, yeah, indeed, a lot of things, yeah, and had lots of conversations about this very interesting and elusive subject. Yeah.
I mean, way back in those early days, I recall we had lots of conflicts of ideas.
Yes,
and there was the conflict of ideas with around the difference in perspective about mentoring between America and Europe, for example, and then between the nature of coaching versus mentoring.
Yeah.
Your recollections of particularly the first one to start with that.
Yeah. Yeah, I can remember having a conversation with you about that very thing. I think we were sat round a table at Sheffield Business School, actually. And I think that at the time I was thinking that's a really interesting idea. And I can remember I did some workshops I was doing work for a company that had various offices around the world, and they flew me out to Houston and to do a workshop on mentoring for them. And I can remember a guy coming up to me with his American accent, and he said to me, "You mean what you're saying is that you don't tell them the answer and they just come up with it themselves by asking them questions?" And I said, "Yeah, that's about it." And he went, "Gee, I think that might just about work." So that was an interesting experience. I've always thought that it was never quite as cut and dried as that. I felt that mentoring showed up in parts of the United States as part of a social movement, as indeed it had done in the UK. And I think what's happened over the years is there's been a kind of hybridization between those two ideas. And I think there are very clearly elements of the kind of developmental type mentoring that we would associate with Europe in the States very strongly. And there's also career sponsorship type mentoring going on in the UK as well as developmental. So I think it's all kind of merged together and become a bit blurred, really.
Yeah, I sometimes think that part of the problem was the failure really right at the beginning, those very early studies by the wonderful Kathy Cram, to really define or differentiate the roles that people played. So there's a conflation of different roles into one.
Yes.
So you've got all the sponsorship stuff and all the learning stuff.
Yes.
Rather than to see actually maybe they don't necessarily belong in the same person.
Exactly. And I think that what's clear is that mentoring can be very individualistic. And what happens between two people is what they create for themselves, but also there's going to be the context in which it happens. So that may influence what seems to be on the agenda. So in an organizational setting, mentoring can be employed for a number of different things. One could be career sponsorship, succession planning, talent management, but another could be development, leadership development. And I've seen all of those arrangements in mentoring. So it can have a number of different functions.
It's been fascinating to watch it be taken back to the original word mentor, of course, in the Odyssey. And the conclusion of different ways that people have read that bloodthirsty, pretty horrible story in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the journey to wisdom,
yes,
the association of mentoring with wisdom in Europe, which seems to have missed a lot of the North American scholars completely.
Not there's what's his name, Chad something, can't remember his name. Brad Johnson, I think, yes, has written about that sort of stuff. I think what's interesting is, of course, in the ancient Greek story, Athena is the personification of wisdom, as some people have argued. But of course, other people have argued she was created out of a piece of Zeus's brain. So therefore, she was a male version of Zeus. So, we end up with all sorts of wonderful interpretations of that. But what's clear is the word mentor means of the mind. And the suffix tor means male. If it was female, it would be mentrix, actually. So it's quite amusing. But anyway, I actually think that although there is the word there of the mind that comes from the ancient Greek, actually the greatest development in mentoring came around the 18th century in France with Fenelon's work.
Yes.
Where he wrote basically a poem of the same type, but it had all the elements in it about learning and development, leadership development, for which poor old Fenelon lost his job, got banished, and lost his pension. But I think I did read somewhere recently that Fenelon's book, The Adventures of Telemachus, was the most read book in Europe at the time. So it obviously influenced a lot of other people in terms of how they presented mentoring. So I would say mentoring is much more linked to that 18th century, the Enlightenment period, the kind of educational stuff that was beginning to come through in society. And it's not surprising that Fenelon changed the ancient Greeks, because that was often the core of the curriculum in those days, classics. So that's kind of where it came from, but I think Fenelon repositioned it somewhat.
Well, if you discount Machiavelli,
Yes.
You could very well say this was the first proper leadership book.
Yeah, in some ways, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It could be argued as that, certainly. Poor old Louis XIV couldn't cope with it.
Exactly. Yes.
Poor chap.
But of course, there's all this stuff going on in other cultures, which are like the Chinese cultures and so
Absolutely.
forth, and the Indian cultures, which
Absolutely.
have lots of parallels which we can draw upon today.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I think looking at what goes on in India, there's a lot of talk about the guru model there, and it's not for. I don't think it's for people like me to challenge that framework, that model. But I think it's a very interesting application. But I do think people can learn that there are a whole range of different skills and abilities involved in the mentoring role. And it's not just about dishing out gratuitous advice, whether somebody needs it or not.
Yeah, I find fascinating from India, also the dark side of mentoring, which and the wonderful story of the little boy that watches the king's children being taught to archery.
Yes.
And goes and makes his own bow and practices and goes in for archery competition and beats all the king's children.
Yes.
And then he goes to the guru and says, please, will you take me on as a pupil? And the guru says, yes, but you must give me a gift. And he says, well, what gift can I bring you? I'm just a poor boy with no protection. He says, your thumbs.
Yes. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
And that's, I mean, that horrifying story.
Yeah.
There is a lot of negative mentoring as well, if we're not careful.
Absolutely, and I think I mean one of the influences that was a book by, what was his name? Can't remember his name. Who wrote this book called Trilby, which became very popular at the beginning of the 20th century and featured in silent movies a lot. This idea of the kind of hypnotist mentor, Svengali, who had control over people, and that kind of model is still in some people's mind, and it put out by Hollywood as a big story in those times, so that exists. Yeah.
Well, let's move on to the other big debates that happened. The people in the mentoring world feeling quite comfortable with knowing who they were, their nice sense of identity, and then along came these upstarts from coaching and said, what you're doing is directed what we're doing a sense of identity and worth.
Yes.
Within the whole area, and that certainly took me by surprise.
Yeah.
And led to a lot of evaluation and self-evaluation on my
part. I think so, and a lot to be learned from that tension, actually, going back over the years. I can remember sitting in a meeting with you, David, where you introduced the idea of coaching, and the C word ought to be introduced to what was the EMC in those days. And I wasn't very pro the idea. And I can remember being persuaded by both you and David Meganson that actually it was happening whether I liked it or not. And and part of the reason was in those days was my understanding of what coaching was, because when I was in consultancy, I used to run coaching courses, and those coaching courses were about helping managers to get their teams to perform better at certain tasks, which is how David Meganson defined it way back in the 1980s, how to perform a task better. But I think what happened probably around 2000, when you start to look at a shift in some of the literature that was coming out, is coaching was getting repositioned, not as to help somebody do a task better, but it started to include this very strong non-directive. The coach is an expert in coaching, but not in the task that the person's trying to do, and those sorts of things. And it was a repositioning of the meaning of that word. And I think the performative elements still exist, but I think also the developmental elements started to creep in at that point as well. So you ended up with coaching positioning itself in a different way around that time. And I think if you look at the way well, I mean, I've done this, I've done literature searches and seen when words like learning and development crop up in terms of coaching, and it's around that sort of period. And it was post probably the most significant book, which came out in the late 90s, The Fifth Discipline, which was reviewed as one of the most influential management books of all time, which everybody was going on about. And that was a book about learning and development. And it seems as though people were allying coaching to that much more. But there was also a lot of, and I'm using yours and David Megginson's words, there's also a lot of shenanigans going on between coaching calling mentoring rubbish and mentoring calling coaching rubbish. And that was a pointless activity because they have so much they could share.
Yeah, and I think it is interesting that still that the EMCC is still the only body in the field that's actually combined coaching and mentoring, recognizing that the gap between them is marginal.
It is, absolutely. And I think that, yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've seen another colleague of ours, Paul Stokes's piece of work, which came out fairly recently, 2021, where he looks at the discourses in coaching and the discourses in mentoring in a way of looking at the problem of definition as a series of dimensions rather than as a fixed definition. And what is clear is that he emphasizes context as an important thing and purpose. So what context does these things happen in and what's the purpose? And people might use them for different purposes in different contexts, and therefore that's going to alter what people think this thing is or these things are.
And that's a nice segue, Bob, into the work we're doing together at the moment on coach maturity. So the coming together of all of these things, and yeah, I mean, what was it that fascinated you about this whole subject that we're working on together?
Well, I think that the whole question of how people develop into this thing we call coaching and perhaps mentoring is extremely interesting, and there's not much written about it. And I think the starting point that you presented was this idea of coach maturity. Now, what I've found with that is when I've presented it to groups of people as discussion, nearly all of them think they're in the top box.
Yes.
Whether they are or not, I'm there. I'm the the integrative, eclectic. I'm one of those. I think what's interesting about that framework is the challenge of it being presented in some kind of stages. I think what is interesting also is that beside each stage, there's a list of questions. Now, I find those far more interesting and far more helpful than the labels attached to the stages that go with it. Because in the work that we've been doing, we're beginning to see that those questions are incredibly relevant to how people learn and develop this business of coaching and or perhaps mentoring. And I think that's fascinating. I think it's really interesting because people don't tend, what we're seeing is that the people that we've spoken to have not followed stages. It's been quite erratic. It's been very serendipitous. Stuff just kind of happens. But there seems to me to be two things that are really important that are coming through. One is intentionality. So the people we've spoken to intend to learn, and they see everything that goes on in their lives as a learning opportunity. And so the next word that I think is really important is reflection or critical reflection. And these people are intending to learn, and they are learning from all sorts of things that go on, and they critically reflect on those things. And as a result, they become reflexive, which is they understand their own learning processes and can do something about it, make choices. And it seems to me that a lot of the people we interviewed were in that kind of position. So they intended to learn, they intended to critically reflect, and they were developing this idea of reflexivity. And it seemed to me that this was an ongoing task. So instead of it being something which they arrive at a destination, they're constantly at it, which brings into question, I think, a lot of the developmental frameworks that are put out there and the competency frameworks, which do seem to have a destination attached to them. And it also, the ways in which these people learn are both formal and informal. And they range from attending a workshop, talking to other coaches, learning from their clients, life's experiences, what they've learned from that. I know in my own case that I learned an awful lot by being seriously ill for a long time, and became much calmer in life as a result. There wasn't a lot.
Most from the screw ups I've made, basically.
Well, yes, exactly. Oops, yes. And I think this kind of erratic, serendipitous chance and choice and intention are very interesting ideas for adult learners as our coaches. And that's what strikes me a lot about that particular work that we're doing, really.
Yeah, for me, there's the whole thing here about identity.
Yes.
And our the identity that we have for ourselves, the identity we want the rest of the world to see. And
yeah.
And that fact, those come together more and more as we go through this maturing process, or whatever we want to call it as a process.
Yes, yeah. I've got a PhD student who's researching coaches' identity through narrative approaches. He's in write-up stage at the moment, and it is extremely interesting how there's this kind of coming together in people who are, let's say, experienced or perhaps mature in what they're doing, of what they say and what they do. Yeah. Which isn't necessarily always the case earlier on in life, so there is this coming together. And I think our researchers also looked at things like the question of what people either start to hold lightly or let go of. Seen is that a lot of people we've interviewed have let go of competency frameworks. Then they don't forget them. They're still there in the background, but they hold them a bit more lightly. And I think also what's interesting is the way in which they seem to do something about their egos, and their ego shifts in a way from themselves into the person that they're working with, in service of the person they are working with. And some people articulated this very interestingly. I mean, one of our interviewees said they let go of greed, which is an incredibly powerful statement, in order to serve these people much better, which I think that's a very interesting idea. So, yeah, these shifts, which are all to do with how they start to position themselves and create their identities for themselves, I think it's quite important. And I was talking to my PhD student last week, and there's lots of, I mean, he's taken a different tack, he's used a different methodology, but there's some interesting synergies between some of the things we've been finding and some of the things he's been finding about identity and how that shifts over time. It's very interesting.
I think it's interesting that you refer to the competency frameworks there, that the assumption behind so many of the competency frameworks is that you when you move from one stage to the other, you do pretty much the same things, but you do it better, or you do it in more deeply, or something like that. But that's not what we've concluded, is it?
No, not at all. Not at all. No, not at all. And sometimes the idea that you have to learn stage one before you can learn stage two is also shown not to be the case, because people do learn, people will come to coaching with a whole range of different background experiences, which you might find in level one, they might find in level three, so I start at level one, and I go back to my very early days in primary education. And one of the reasons why I stopped doing it was because the national curriculum was on the horizon, and I don't think I could have worked under those conditions. But one of the things that I learned very strongly as a primary school teacher is how important it is to start from where the child is, not from where you would expect them to be according to the theoretical staged model. And I think looking at that in terms of coaching is as coaches, we have to start where we are, not where we ought to be according to some external framework or model, you know.
Yeah.
This is certainly how I try to run the courses that I'm involved in, is we work with what people already know and draw on that into the group, and in that way they learn from each other as well.
Yeah, what fascinates me is the assumption that in order to become to achieve some kind of mastery, you have to be able to do more. Whereas everything
Yes.
we've been learning says actually no, you do less.
You do less, exactly. You do a lot less, and you become more comfortable with all that. Yeah, which is also very interesting as well. Yeah, I've just been talking to some people who've been doing a postgraduate certificate with me, and they're wanting to move on and do the next stage, and there's lots of sort of anxieties about that. And I said, it's more of the same, really. Only you do more of the work.
I like that. Yes. Yeah, I think yes, that's something about getting older. The older you get, the easier it is to let other people do all the hard work.
Exactly.
What do you think, Bob, about where this? I don't like the word profession. I mean, I've sort of gone on record saying, is coaching, mentoring, is it a profession? Is it a vocation, or is it what I like to call in the middle of provocation? But that's simply playing with words. But where do you think it's going?
Well, I think there's a difference between where I hope it would go and where it is going. I think one of my thoughts is that there has been a forgetting of where all this stuff has come from, which is why I'm quite interested in history. And I think history has an important element of informing the present, because if it doesn't, what's the point of it, really? So history needs to inform the present. And I think the history of both coaching and mentoring, without going into it in a lot of detail, do come from a kind of humanistic position. And a humanistic position is to do with the love of being a human being and working with other fellow human beings and all the challenges and foibles and problems that generates. But aren't we truly wonderful because we learn and we can help each other to learn? And that seems to me quite a kind of fundamental. And I've always had this issue of trying to box things in tightly. And what I see professional bodies doing is trying to box things in. And this is partly because in order to become a profession, you have to have a set piece. You have to have a kind of set practice. I've just been debating this actually with some people that, if we look at the nursing profession, there are certain ways of going on that constitute being a nurse that are agreed throughout the NHS. There are procedures. Now, we haven't got that in coaching. We haven't got that in mentoring, despite professionalization trying to impose that on us. And I think we are fledgling still. We are beginning to understand more about this work we do and why it's helpful and interesting. And I just hope that the future is, I hope that the professional associations lighten up a bit and think more flexibly about some of these things that we're finding out in research and thinking, okay, so what are the implications for that? How might that inform practice? And I think for me, that would be good. I also see that coaching and mentoring are merging. I think they are hybridizing, and I've noticed that I've worked with various groups of people around the world on webinars, and that through professional bodies actually, which is a bit ironic, but there you go, where you've got people who start to talk to me and talk to each other about the things that they actually do in practice, as if they're revealing a guilty secret. Because they're saying, I don't do what the professional body says I should do. I do much more like what you're talking about, Bob. And yet they feel they can't vocalize that. So why aren't they vocalizing it and saying to their professional body, oi, in practice, this is actually what goes on, and maybe the way in which you position your things in the professional body needs to reflect much more of that, rather than trying to control, trying to box it all in, and trying to present a much more flexible and adaptable approach to these things.
Well, I guess I would see that as rethinking what we mean by mastery.
Yeah.
Because the definition of mastery is you actually break all the rules that you had before.
Well, exactly. A master goes beyond, I would have thought.
Yes.
Absolutely. And I think therein lies a challenge. Now, I would say about professional associations that part of what they do, which is absolutely brilliant, and they all do it, are the CPD offerings. And they're often facilitated by experienced people who share their stuff, and they generally facilitate them in a coaching and mentoring way, so that people engage in a dialogue of reflection about what's going on. And I think that's incredibly useful and helpful. And things appear in those discussions which don't seem to appear in the published documents. So there is a kind of tension here. I'm also very keen on other applications of coaching and mentoring in a social setting. So, for example, I'm part of an organization in my own city that focuses on what we call community mentoring. And we work with, a membership of this organization, we offer our skills free of charge for community projects, whether that be working with litter on the street, or working in community centers, or with children, or hate crime initiatives, or with teachers in schools, offering our services free of charge in order to help people do things differently within our communities. And I think what's interesting about what's going on in my city is that there's another city in the UK who's just starting to mirror what we're doing, and they've established themselves, and it's not too far from you, David. And I think that's very exciting development. And I also know from some of my own researches that in certain places of South America, for example, coaching is being used as a social process of emancipation, which I think is really important and very useful. And that seems to be a good use of this thing we call coaching, and indeed mentoring.
Yeah, I mean, it takes me back 25 years or more. The first time we proposed, it nearly happened, but it didn't. The grant was taken away just before it happened. But we did talk about one city becoming a city of coaching and mentoring, where you had the schools and all of these things interrelated, so that you would.
Yes.
So a lot of what you're achieving in York is very similar to that.
We're working on it, and our membership's growing, and it's interesting to see, and Reading are doing the same. So there's Coaching York, there's Coaching Reading, and we've been in conversations with people in Coaching Reading in supporting, helping them, encouraging them to carry on, because it's blooming hard work.
and that's a great way to bring all this to a close, because this whole world of coaching and mentoring has expanded vastly since we first became engaged with it.
Absolutely.
And it keeps finding new applications, new ways to go beyond just sorting out the problems of one individual, to actually
absolutely
look at the skills and the benefits of society.
Mm-hmm.
Me, that's the future. It's not about a profession on its own. It's actually making this something that is a key instrument in creating a better world.
I would hope so. It does have that promise sitting there somewhere.
Well, that's for next generations to
pick up on.
Bob, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, David. Good to see you.